so first important things that you need to know is that your test is, of course, on Thursday. You guys tell me what's on your test. What topics? Muscles, skin, nervous system 1, which is histology and organization, and brain. Okay, with the exception of the fact that the cranial nerves, although we'll talk about them today, they're not going to be on the second test, they'll be on the third test, because I want you to have time to see them and understand them in lab. So we'll just roll that last little tidbit over to the third test, but the rest of the brain will be on this test. Does that make sense? Okay. So, seems like there's something I'm forgetting to tell you. Okay, so I want you to pay special attention today to when I ask you questions, because I'm going to try to give you some insight as to the type of brain questions you can expect on the test. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me acknowledge also that I understand that the brain is difficult and relatively unfamiliar. So here's what I will do for you to make it doable. If I, for instance, use a blurb to describe what a brain function does, I will try to use that exact blurb to ask the question. So for instance, there's a portion of the brain that we're going to learn today that's responsible for visual and auditory reflexes. So instead of me saying, unless it's a bonus questions don't have to be clear. Instead of me saying somebody throws a ball at your head and you move very quickly, I will say which is the part of the brain that's responsible for visual and auditory reflexes. Does that make sense? So that you can pull up a familiar phrase. Because it's really complicated, all of the brain functionality is really complicated, yeah? So I can simplify it by repeating the terms that you are used to. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'll go back and check out the test and reword the questions so that for people who study deeply, that study should pop up the right thing. Does that make sense? Okay. Except bonus questions. I'm going to try to confuse you on bonus questions. It's the only thing that's entertaining to me about the entire damn test, honestly. So, you ready? Okay, so this is where we left off last time, and I just have a teeny tiny bit more to say about the whole left brain versus right brain thing. Did we talk about women versus men in left brain, right brain? We didn't talk about that, did we? Okay. So, and did we talk about the right cerebral hemisphere or just the left? We did? Okay. All right. So, to oversimplify, left brain basically patterns, and right brain really spatial awareness and like nonverbal communication, recognition of faces, that kind of stuff. Also imparting emotional content. So, for instance, the difference in both me saying and you understanding these two words, these two phrases that are the same, me saying to you, yeah, right, and me saying to you, yeah, right. The understanding of those two, because they are the same words, happens in the right cerebral hemisphere. Does that make sense? Okay, so two things I want to talk about before we move on to this, move on from this, and that is that women tend to have less dramatic hemisphere specialization than men, meaning that there's more overlap in left and right functionality in women than there is in men. Clinically, that ends up being important because if a woman had a stroke on one side of her brain, she's slightly more likely to regain functionality than a man is because of the less dramatic lateralization. Does that make sense to you? Okay, and then the only other thing that I want to talk about this is a really interesting behavior that you can do that actually ends up forcing the left and the right cerebral hemispheres to work together, really integrate their functionality, and actually ends up getting you more white matter between the two halves of the cerebral hemisphere. And that is both learning, writing, and playing music. Because I want you to think about, let's just think about a piano player, right? A pianist, somebody who has been playing piano since childhood. First of all, to coordinate your left and right hands, you are going to have quite a bit of crossover, right? Wiring between the left and the right. But then in order to play piano, you also need to, if you're going to be able to read, write, and play music, you're going to be able to need to take that symbolism, right? Left, right, left side, and convert it into motor activity, which is going to involve both sides. Does that make sense? And then if you're going to be a good pianist, you're going to be able to impart emotional content, right? Does that make sense? Into what you're playing. And then if you're going to be a really good pianist who's also writing music, you're going to have to be able to create new patterns, yes, and convert them, right? So one of the things that they've actually figured out is post-mortem, if you look at the brain of a music composer, right, someone who writes music, and they haven't studied that many, so the sample size is relatively small. The white matter that connects the left and the right cerebral hemispheres is actually measurably thicker in musicians than it is in the rest of us, which is kind of fascinating, which is part of the reason that I have forced my poor child, ever since he was 5, to take music lessons. Freaking hates piano. But now he's a little badass drummer, so. Okay, so let's start looking at that white matter and see what kind of white matter we were talking about. So starting here. So here is where we were. We were looking at the most superficial portion, which was the gray matter. And the most superficial gray matter is called a what? Cerebral cortex, exactly. And now we're going deeper than that. We are going to what we call the central white matter, right? And the central white matter doesn't look like a whole hell of a lot here, but you can look at it in a couple of different ways. Again, this is another awesome space-filling model that somebody created to show you all of the white matter tracts that actually exist in the brain. Please note that some are going forward and back, some are going up and down, and some are going this direction. And then here's another look at the same thing. This is a computer simulation of the white matter in the brain. You've got some that are going up and down, some that are going left and right, and you've got some that are going back and forward. Okay, so this is the central white matter of the brain. It is not processing, it is wiring, right? It is wiring between the other portions of your brain. So if, for instance, you had understanding patterns on this side that needs to impart emotional content on this side, you would need to use white matter that goes across to communicate that one to the other. That makes sense? So if you took neuroanatomy, which is like a 4,000 level course at the U, you would learn individual names of these tracts. So remind me what I mean when I say tract. What is a tract? What? Go ahead. White matter, myelinated white matter in the central nervous system. If it was in the peripheral nervous system, it wouldn't be a tract, it would be a nerve. Okay, now note to self, those terms are missed constantly on the test. And I think it's because you just like flip past them really quickly and you think you know them, but you don't know them until you teach them to yourself, right? Okay, so let's talk about the different types of tracts that exist in the central white matter. We're not going to learn individual tract names, just categories of tracts. You ready? Okay, so the categories of tracts, I'm going to do these two first, okay? The categories of tracts that exist in the brain are projection tracts. Let's do those. Projection tracts, let me show you a picture of them. So projection tracts, what they are doing is they are tracts that are going high to low, top to bottom, bottom to top, right? And you can remember them because they project upwards. So do you see these that are drawn in green? They are, of course, not green, right? But what they are is wiring going to and from, like the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord to the cerebral cortex. So let me reinforce that. So what I'm saying is, if I feel this, right? If I do this, that information has to go up a nerve first. But then once it gets into the central nervous system, it has to go up a tract. And the type of tract is going to be projection tract, right? Because I need to get it to my cerebral cortex. And interestingly, I actually need to get it to the cerebral cortex on the opposite side of the body. And I'll point out that in just a second. So it's going to go up and it's going to go to the opposite side of the body. See if you guys remember from last time. Where does it need to go in the cerebral cortex in order for me to be consciously aware that this is happening? Who remembers?
It's got to go into the central nervous system.
Central nervous system, which portion of the cerebral cortex, you know, is devoted to conscious awareness of sensation? It's the postcentral gyrus, the somatosensory cortex and the postcentral gyrus. Does that sound familiar? Okay. On the opposite side of the brain, which lobe of the cerebral cortex is that part of? Parietal lobe. Okay. I want to help you guys. The way that I remember which one of those precentral and postcentral just does what is touchy-feely. Touchy-feely. Touch is motor in the front. Feel is sensory. It's in the back. Right? Touchy-feely. Does that make sense? Okay. Touchy-feely will also work with the spinal cord because motor activity is in the front of the spinal cord and sensory activity is in the back of the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Okay, so now why does it go to the opposite side? Why does this projection tract do that? Because this, right in the brainstem, and we're going to learn it later, the tracts actually cross in the brainstem. This is way older than mammals. We don't know when it happened evolutionarily, but during the folding of the brain, what happened is the tracts started to fold, they folded over one another. So this is called the decussation of pyramids, and what you just have is they're going up parallel to one another until they hit there, and then they cross and go the other side of the brain. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is projection tracts. So let me show you the other two kinds, and then we will reinforce it even further. Okay, so the other kinds of tracts are projection tracts go top to bottom. Commissural tracts go left to right. Okay, a commissural tract will connect left and right parts. Okay, so a commissural tract includes the huge commissural tract that you'll be able to see in lab this week or you saw on Friday. And this is an enormous collection of commissural tracts called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum right here is in the middle of the brain. Can you see all these tracts connecting left and right? Yeah, it's really easy to see. So that is the corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum literally means big body. So I like this comic, it's cute. Look at the book that the brain is reading. 50 Shades of Gray Matter. So big body. The corpus callosum, a nice big body. There's a couple of different ways to look at it. Let's look at it from a mid-sagittal section. It looks like that. It's really easy to find in the brain, okay, or in models. From a coronal section, it looks like that, right? Okay. So the corpus callosum is probably the biggest landmark of white matter that you're going to be able to find. If you look at a mid-sagittal section of any brain, it's really easy to see it. It's the enormous chunk of white matter right there. Does that make sense? And the corpus callosum is what kind of tract again? Commissural tract, right? It's the big one that you can see. It's not the only commissural tract. It's just the only one you're going to learn the name of. Okay? Now, the reason I went through that music thing again is because this is what we see in music composers post-mortem who have donated their brain, right? You'd have to be able to do that in order to do this, is that their corpus callosum is actually measurably thicker in people who compose music. Does that mean it's not thicker in other types of professions? We haven't analyzed that yet. Someone just came up with the question of, I think it might be really thicker in musicians, and we have a relatively small sample size, but it's thicker than the average of the population at large, which is kind of interesting. Just gives us reinforcement that you can actually change your brain structure by what you do with your brain. So that's called the corpus callosum, and that is a commissural tract. And then the last type of tract is called an association tract. And an association tract is the white matter that connects, for instance, anterior, posterior, anterior within a hemisphere. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is kind of a bad example, but it's the only one that I can think of. So if I, for instance, see an apple and recognize it's an apple, that happens in my occipital lobe, right? It's like, okay, I see this thing and I have a visual assessment, conscious visual assessment. If I make the word apple out of it, of course, it's got to involve my temporal lobe, right? But then what if I see the apple, identify it as an apple, and then decide with my own volition, my own will, to eat the apple? That would happen in my frontal cortex, right? So that would use association tracts all the way on that side. And of course, it'd probably go over the other side too. I was just trying to make a good example to give you guys an understanding, okay? So here we go. Let's look at this figure again and see if you guys can tell me what kind of tracts we're dealing with. Okay, what kind of tract is this? Going, whoop. That's projection tract, yeah? Okay. These guys that are going up are probably projection tracts as well. How about these? Projection. How about these? Those are commissural tracts. Does that make sense? And these are a little hard to see because they're kind of hidden in there, but you do have some back there that are going this direction. Do you see that one? It's going that direction. That's what? That's association tracts. Is that okay? Okay. So, again, each of these tracts individually has their own little name, but you do not need to know that kind of detail right now. Okay? So everybody good with the white matter, the central white matter? So we did cerebral cortex, deeper, and we're going central white matter. And then this is where people start getting confused. So if you're slightly checking out this morning, pinch yourself, okay? Because if you don't need help with this, you will be the only one. I have trouble with this stuff, and I had trouble even figuring out how to teach it, but we can learn it together. Okay, so now we are going to deeper than that, and we are going to what we call the cerebral nuclei or the basal nuclei. Let me show you where they are in relationship to the stuff that we've already learned. You ready? Okay. So follow me for a second. This is the cerebrum, and what's the gray matter on the outside called? Cerebral cortex. Here's the white matter, yes, right? Okay, you can't see where they're going specifically except for these, yeah? Okay. Deep to that are paired chunks of gray matter. Do you see these? These paired chunks of gray matter? Yeah? These are called cerebral nuclei, or sometimes basal nuclei because they're at the base of the brain. Everybody with me? Okay. This one is actually not part of it. I don't know why they colored it, but really, basically it's these guys right here. They are paired chunks of gray matter. And so now we are moving toward older functionality. So we had intellect, personality, right? Now we're moving toward older functionality. We're moving toward controlling motor activity, but not voluntarily. We're moving toward old things like rage, sex drive, hunger. Those kinds of things are happening deeper in here. Does that make sense? Okay. Emotion happens deeper in here. So these are called the cerebral nuclei. You do not need to be able to identify them individually, right? But you do need for me to be able to point at one of these and say, okay, that's a cerebral nucleus. Yes? Okay. All right, so let's talk about some functionality of some of them. And some of them you've actually probably heard of before, but you might not know it. So let's talk about those, and then I've got a cool website to show you too. Okay, so the cerebral nuclei are also called the basal nuclei. Sometimes, and very, very commonly still, they're called basal ganglia as well. That term, though, is incorrect. Can anybody tell me why it's incorrect, even if it's common? Why? Ganglia are in the PNS. However, you will find in popular literature, in articles all the time, them still referred to as the basal ganglia. Okay, so basal nuclei, cerebral nuclei is correct. Basal ganglia is incorrect, but very common. They are internal clusters of paired gray matter, either side, deep to the cerebral cortex, and they are below, like, the lateral ventricles. Like, here's the lateral ventricles. They're kind of lateral and a little below those, right? Okay, the lateral ventricles are actually part of the cerebrum, and these are, like, below those. Okay, so paired clusters of gray matter, and I'll show you the 3D of them in just a second. Let's just look at some of their functionality. This is not comprehensive of their functionality. One of those cerebral nuclei is responsible for starting and stopping voluntary skeletal movement activity. What happens is you decide it in your cerebral cortex, and then you send it through there, and then it controls starting and stopping it. It doesn't control continuing it, but it's just starting and stopping it. And the reason we know that is because Parkinson's disease is when that part goes bad and you lose control of starting and stopping your skeletal movement, right? So you have this tremor that you can't actually stop. Is that okay? Okay. And then some other stuff is in there as well. Emotion, fear, vigilance, anxiety. Have you guys heard of the amygdala? Or the amygdaloid body? Have you heard of it? If you're an anxious person, that thing is really working overtime. So let me show you just a little bit. This is a phenomenal website. It's also a free app. Okay, on your phone or your iPad. I don't know if it works on other tablets. It is really good quality. It was put together by Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory as part of a Department of Education grant. So it's got really, really good science in it. In addition, it also allows those of us like me who have trouble picturing things 3D, the capacity to do it. So let's see, even here they called it the basal ganglia. Okay, So I just want to show you where these are, okay, and talk a little bit about their functionality. So as far as the basal ganglia go, you can stick the labels on. No, you don't have to know them individually. You're just starting to try to find them with reference to other things, right? So these structures in here are gray matter. Here is the amygdaloid body that's involved in fear and vigilance and those kinds of things. Those of us who are really anxious, I tend to be relatively anxious. I have a continual battle going on between my amygdala, which says you need to be vigilant, and my cerebral cortex, which says calm the hell down and behave yourself, right? Does that make sense? Okay. In addition, things in here are like rage and sex drive. And sometimes those things are working against your cerebral cortex. I know that you have felt this as a human. You've had these drives that you know are inappropriate for social interaction, right? So for instance, you should not grab a boob just because you think about grabbing a boob, right? We know that. So the grab a boob is deep in your brain, old, right? The don't grab a boob is in your cerebral cortex. And you can almost feel them going against one another. Or here's a good example. Have you ever felt super duper angry or jealous in a public situation? Yeah? And you really want to clock somebody, right? And you know that they deserve it, right? The anger or jealousy is deep in your brain. And what keeps you from being like incarcerated, right? Your cerebral cortex. And you can feel them acting against one another. But of course, your cerebral cortex is later to develop, both evolutionarily and developmentally as a human. Because what does a toddler do when they see something they want? They take it, yeah? Right? And what happens over time is their cerebral cortex starts to develop and they start to have the social interactions, maybe the negative interactions, or you talking to them about the behavior, like just because you want to grab that doesn't mean you should grab it, right? Just because you want to punch them or bite them doesn't mean you should punch them or bite them, right? So that's the cerebral cortex working over. This has been functioning for longer than your cerebral cortex has actually been developed. This is where rage and sex drive is. It's also where some important things are, like the nucleus accumbens right here. No, you don't have to remember that name. Is really, really involved in the addiction pathway. So when you see something, you like it, right, and you want to do it, and you want to do it over again, the nucleus accumbens will basically make you release dopamine. It feels really good, and then you want to have that feeling again and again and again and again. Eventually, the nucleus accumbens in somebody who's really, really addicted, like let's say you were doing opioids, right, and you're doing heroin. There's really no casual heroin stories. Have you noticed that? Right? It's not like, I did heroin once. It was like, fine. But I didn't want to do it again. So what happens with really, really addictive pathways is you do the behavior, and then eventually the nucleus accumbens develops a whole bunch of white matter that goes to your prefrontal cortex and inhibits your prefrontal cortex activity. In most of us, when you think, hey, heroin sounds fun, your prefrontal cortex says, that's a terrible idea. Just a bad idea. When you get into this pathway, what happens is the nucleus accumbens starts to continually inhibit the prefrontal cortex. So you lose your inhibitory capacity, right? Your will, right? In the same way that other people have it. So these old functionalities are really deep in the brain. Now, notice that they are not life-sustaining, but they are longevity-sustaining, right? I know that addiction sounds terrible unless it's addiction to actually eating food, then it's fine, right? And sex drive might sound terrible, but it was really good for the species, right? Only in Utah does sex drive sound terrible. The rest of the country's like, yeah, you should probably do that. So these are old functionalities. They're really deep in the brain. And collectively, they are called the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei or the cerebral nuclei. So emotion, fear, vigilance, the amygdala. Okay, so Tourette syndrome, interestingly, is a combination of like these emotional outbursts and physical outbursts, and it's usually a problem with your cerebral nuclei. That makes sense to you guys? And specifically, they happen so quickly that your cerebral cortex can't override what's happening with Tourette syndrome. Okay? All right, so now we are going to go deeper than that. So let's show you where we are. So I want to give you a metaphor that we're thinking about. So now we are going to go even deeper. And what we're going to try to do is get right to the middle of the brain, right on top of the brainstem. So I want you to imagine for a second that your brain structure is like an ice cream cone. Yes? And you dip the ice cream cone in chocolate before you put the ice cream on, right? Then you put the ice cream on, and then you dip the whole damn thing in nuts, okay? So the nuts on the outside, cerebral cortex, yeah? Go deeper than that, and you'll find the white matter, which is most of the ice cream. Right smack on top of that, there's a chunk of rhesus. Ooh, this sounds amazing. I'm making myself hungry. Okay, that rhesus is the cerebral nuclei, right? And then the chocolate that's on top of the cone is where we are right now. The cone is going to be your brainstem, but the chocolate on top, right on the very top, on the top of the brainstem is where we are going. This is called the diencephalon. So let me show you where your diencephalon is. Okay, so the diencephalon is going to be, do you see these that are more medial than the cerebral nuclei? Do you see them? Right there? And the brainstem is going to be just below them. I'll show you right here as well. Okay, cerebral nuclei are all out here, slightly lateral, yeah? And then these guys right here, right on top of the brainstem, that's the diencephalon. If you look from a mid-sagittal section, it is going to be, follow me here, this was the white matter, yeah? In this picture, you can't see any of the cerebral nuclei. Why? Because it's mid-sagittal, right? And the cerebral nuclei are all lateral. Does that make sense? So what you're going to see is this chunk right here. This is all the diencephalon. So when you want to find it, you go just below the corpus callosum, right? All the way down to right above the pituitary gland, and draw a line right back here to this little nubbin that I'll tell you. So this is all right here. So you can find this, right? The cerebral aqueduct, right? So it's pretty much everything that is below the corpus callosum and above the cerebral aqueduct in the middle of the brain. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is called the diencephalon, and it includes some structures that you've already learned and some that you haven't. Okay, so I'll show you a couple of different pictures of it. The diencephalon includes three parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Okay, so all of them have thalamus in it. So that should be it should be easy to remember. Okay, so let's find it on a mid-sagittal section, because this is how you're going to see it in lab. But I need to tell you that what you see in lab is not actually what it looks like. So in a mid-sagittal section, let me show you. The thalamus is this region right here. Okay, this region right here looks like you're just pointing to the middle, but you're just pointing to the medial surface of each half of the thalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is this region below the thalamus right here. That's why it's called the hypothalamus. And the epithalamus sticks off of the back of the thalamus. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I need to reinforce something. So this is actually also the third ventricle. Do you remember the third ventricle? It looks like a chicken head. But the third ventricle and the thalamus are in the same general location, but one of them is tissue and one of them is a space. Which one of them is tissue? The thalamus is the tissue, yes? And the third ventricle is a space. So how do you end up having both? Because the two halves of the thalamus are concave, and when you put them together, you still have a space between them. Does that make sense? Okay, so now let's talk about what the thalamus actually looks like, and then I'll show you the website as well. The thalamus is not just what you see from a mid-sagittal section. It's actually two little egg-like structures that are gray matter, yeah? And they are on either side of the third ventricle. And they're connected by this little thing right here. It's not actually a tract, it's actually gray matter that connects the two halves of the thalamus. But all you see of it when you look at a brain is here is the interthalamic adhesion, right? Okay, that's what connects the two halves of the thalamus, and here's the medial surface of the right half of the thalamus. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so the thalamus is actually kind of complicated. You do not have to know these individually, but it's actually multiple nuclei. Each of them are different colors, and they all do different things. They're not actually different colors. Each of them are indicated as different colors in this picture, and they all do different things. No, you do not need to know the individual nuclei. So let me show you the thalamus here, and then I'll tell you what the thalamus does. 3D brain. 3D brain, and it's free because it was paid for by the federal government. You already paid for it. Okay? Okay, so where are you, thalamus? Oh, here it is. Okay, so let me show you what the thalamus looks like. So actually, one more time. Watch real quick before I switch. So remember your cerebral nuclei, right? Look at those. Do you see where those are? And then now let's look at where the thalamus is with reference to that. So keep that in mind. Look at it real quick. And then where's the thalamus? Thalamus is right there. That makes sense? Okay, so let's show you the thalamus from a couple of different views. Two little eggs, right? Right? This little chunk right there is that connects the two halves of the thalamus. Okay, all right, so what does the thalamus do? Why the hell do you care? So thalamus is gray matter, and what it does is relays sensory information to the right part of the cerebral cortex so that when I touch my hand, I know it's actually happening on my hand. So it's basically like a relay station or a router that gets the information to the right part of the cerebral cortex. So way back when, did you guys, I know I Love Lucy is older than all of you guys. It's older than me too, believe it or not. But did you ever see the I Love Lucy in which she's like a switchboard operator and she actually has to get the peg in the right hole in order to connect people, and she's totally jacking it up because that's what she does? Okay, so, right, got it? So this is how I imagine the thalamus. What the thalamus is doing is making sure that the information that comes in gets put in the right hole to end up so that you know that the sensation is happening in one place or the other. Something goes wrong with your thalamus, you might think this is happening on your foot. Does that make sense to you? So it's a relay station between sensation and the cerebral cortex. Got it? A relay station or router. All right. So what I mean when I said before that I would try to be consistent when I write your test questions is if you see relay station between, don't just memorize relay station, you also have to have sensory and cerebral cortex, right? Because what if I put something else there, motor, right? Relay station between sensory information and the cerebral cortex, then the part of the brain that comes up for you is what? Thalamus. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so that's the thalamus. And then the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is here, guys. Okay, it is below the thalamus. You find it by finding the pituitary gland if it's still on there, right? And everything like below. It's like the beak of the chicken head, right? Okay, so what is the hypothalamus? That thing does damn near everything physiologically. And it's so anatomically unimpressive that you're like, really, that? How does it end up doing so much functionality physiologically? Because this is what it really is. So, and no, you don't have to know these. It's a bunch of individual little nuclei, each of which has a different function. Does that make sense? Like each of these colored parts has a different function. You don't have to know them. Don't worry about it. But that's how it has such dramatic functionality, because let's look at what the hypothalamus does. Big picture of the hypothalamus, maintaining homeostasis. But it does it by a bunch of different ways. Let's look at how the hypothalamus maintains homeostasis. The hypothalamus, it doesn't do it all by itself. It does it in conjunction with other portions of your brain. But it is involved in regulating sleep, regulating hunger, thirst, body temperature, some emotion and behavior. It works with the basal nuclei to do that. Some emotion and behavior, sex drive, rage, again with the basal nuclei. Also regulates the autonomic nervous system, which is fight or flight, feed or breed. Remember that? It regulates that. It also regulates the 6 different hormones secreted from the pituitary gland, and it makes and secretes 2 of its own hormones, ADH and oxytocin. This is oxytocin. It's like the bonding or connection hormone, right? Okay, so it does damn near everything related to homeostasis. What it really is, I think of the hypothalamus as what it does is gather sensory information from your nervous system and hormonal information from your bloodstream and uses all of that to figure out, okay, what is needed for homeostasis, and then it sends that information out. So it's like this really smart, important part, and it is the most common integration center for phys. Yeah, for those of you who know phys, it's the most common. It's not the only one, but it's the most common integration center for physiology and homeostasis. Does that make sense? Okay, so if I say homeostasis, you remember what one word if you can't remember anything else? Hypothalamus, okay? All right. Now, the A student might need to be able to come up with a couple of these, though, right? A couple of like specifics. Okay. The epithalamus is last, and the epithalamus is back here. The only structure you need to know out of the epithalamus is that little nubbin right there. That's the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is related to your circadian rhythms, your day-night cycling. Does anybody know what hormone it releases? Melatonin. Yeah, it releases melatonin. And in humans, the primary function of melatonin is setting your circadian rhythms. By the way, it's actually controlled by the hypothalamus. So yes, the pineal gland actually sets your circadian rhythms, but only because the hypothalamus told it to, right? So what it does is it releases melatonin, and melatonin is really your end-of-day signal. So melatonin tells you when you should get sleepy and you should slow down your metabolism and you should get ready to go to bed. If you were a super duper regular person about the time you go to sleep and the time you wake up every morning, then let's say you go to bed every single night at 11 and you wake up every single morning at 6:30, okay? Then what's going to happen at 10:30, even if you decide you're going to pull an all-nighter, is what? You're going to get tired, right? Okay? And then if you wake up at 6:30 every morning, but you decide you're going to go to Fiji on vacation, when are you going to wake up? You wake up at 6:30 your time, regardless of what it has to do with, right? And so there's a benefit to this regularity, but there's also a negative, right? And I'm a person who does not ever go to sleep or get up at the same time ever. So I don't really get the benefit of this regularity. I never get sleepy when I want to go to sleep. And what happens if my alarm doesn't go off? I ain't waking up at all. It's not going to happen. So I set like 5 alarms. The last one is in my son's room, and it's so far away and so loud that you just have to get up and go get it. Okay, so that's the pineal gland, and it secretes melatonin. Its primary function is day-night cycles in humans. Although, if you were another critter, another kind of mammal that has seasonal cycling, the pineal gland melatonin actually regulates like hibernation seasons and migration seasons and breeding seasons for other organisms, but we're not very seasonal animals. So it doesn't really do that in humans very much. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is the 3 parts. So you guys tell me, again, listening to questions and trying to see if you can do test questions. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus make up a region of the brain called the what? Diencephalon. Yeah, okay. So we were just on the chocolate on the top of the cone, and now we are moving down, right? We are going to move down to the cone, which is the brainstem, okay? And the brainstem is the lowest portion of the brain, and that's where we're going now. So third ventricle was here. How do we tell when we are in the brainstem? Here's what you do. So the diencephalon, if you draw a line from the hypothalamus all the way to under the pineal gland and then up to the top or up to the bottom of the corpus callosum, that's all diencephalon, right? Everything below that right here is going to be brainstem. That make sense? Okay, so you can tell when you're in the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem has 3 parts. You ready? They are from top to bottom. This portion right here, which is called the mesencephalon or the midbrain. I don't know why the hell they thought that was the middle of the brain, because it's the bottom, okay? And then the next portion down, I'll just show them all to you, and then we'll move through the portions. Hold on. Where is the picture they wanted? Okay, so the 3 portions of the brainstem are the mesencephalon or midbrain, the pons, yeah, and then the medulla oblongata. And that's from top to bottom. Everybody okay with that? Okay. So you can tell you're in the mesencephalon because you actually see this aqueduct, right? Does that make sense? And remember the aqueduct? You learned the aqueduct before? Okay. The aqueduct leads between which 2 ventricles? 3rd and the 4th, right? So the aqueduct is right there, and if you see the aqueduct, you're in the mesencephalon. Okay, so let's go back and add a little bit more detail to it. Okay, so here it is. The midbrain, but you can look at it from a couple of different views. So let's look at it from a couple of different views. Okay, so the mesencephalon or the midbrain has both gray matter and white matter. The gray matter will have a function. The white matter will be carrying information from one place or the other. And it's composed of both gray matter nuclei and white matter tracts. So let's learn them. So this is a little hard for me. For some reason, this spatial arrangement is hard for me to understand. So I want to look at this figure, okay, and orient yourself, okay? These are the two halves of the thalamus, right? So below there, but above the pons, is this aqua region right there. That is going to be the mesencephalon. Does that make sense to you guys? Mesencephalon. Or you can look at it from this view, right? Below the thalamus, but above the pons is the mesencephalon. Everybody good with that? Okay. So the mesencephalon has some gray matter and some white matter. The gray matter is primarily back here, and it looks like two butts. Do you see it? Okay. So let's look at it from a mid-sagittal section. From a mid-sagittal section, there's half of two butts, right? The right half of each butt. Okay. Everybody good with that? Now, how do you find those butts? They're right below the what? Right below the pineal gland and right above the cerebellum, right? Okay, so if you have a sheep brain in your hand this week and you want to see them, seriously, they look like baby butts. It's hilarious. You hold the sheep brain in your hand with the cerebellum facing you, and you separate the cerebellum from the cerebrum, and you look up there, and there's a booty in there, right? There's a booty with a little nubbin on top, right? And you can see a little nubbin, which is the pineal gland, and you're going to have to see the booties too. Does that make sense? Okay. So these guys are the superior and inferior colliculi. Okay, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi. Collectively, you're going to hate this term. Sorry. They are called, collectively, all four of them, are called the corpora, which means body, quadragemina, which means four twins, which is actually quadruplets. I don't know why they didn't call it quadruplets. Okay, the four twin body. Sometimes they also call it the tectal plate, but I don't ever use that term. Okay, so why the hell do you care? What do those do that has anything related to your life? Those are responsible for visual and auditory reflexes. Not conscious visual and auditory, but when something loud booms over here, what do? I turn away from it. That is older and faster than just hearing something, understanding, maybe being curious and moving toward it, right? This is sort of a life-sustaining functionality. Or if something comes at your face, before you even think about moving, if it is coming at your face, you're going to move your face away, right? So that is these structures right here, the superior and inferior colliculi. Does that make sense? Collectively, those are called the corpora quadragemina. Now, some organisms have really good eyesight and poor hearing. One of the pair will be bigger. Some organisms have really good hearing and poor eyesight. The other of the pair will be bigger. In humans, they're about the same size, the superior and inferior colliculi. When you look at the sheep, one of them will be bigger than the other, and you'll have to figure out what you know about sheep. Note to self, they're pretty dumb. Sheep are like kind of heavy, but their brain is like this big. It's so tiny. Okay, so that's the superior and inferior colliculi. Now I want you guys to think about this one. The other part of the aqua part is this is called the cerebral peduncle. And the cerebral peduncle is white matter, and you can see it from here too. And you can look at the white matter and you can almost tell which direction the tracts are going, and you can tell me what kind of tracts they are. Yeah, they're projection tracts. Okay, what the cerebral peduncles are doing is primarily carrying information from spinal cord to brain, brain to spinal cord. Does that make sense? And you can see that they're projection tracts by looking at them. Because you can see which direction the stripes are going, right? That make sense? Okay, now, one last little tidbit about this part of the brain is, let's look at it one more time. Do you see this aqueduct running through it, right? Lateral to this on the other side, it's slightly lateral, so you wouldn't label it here, would be a cerebral peduncle, right? This is the corpora quadragemina, just the right side of the corpora quadragemina. And you've got the aqueduct running through here. Do you see why they want to change the name from cerebral aqueduct to mesencephalic aqueduct? Because is that aqueduct in the cerebrum? It is not. Where is it? It's in the mesencephalon. So yeah, you can keep calling it cerebral aqueduct if you want to, but you can see why there's actually a better name for it. It's the mesencephalic aqueduct. And I wouldn't count cerebral aqueduct wrong because it's still that way in your textbook in some places, although in some places it's not. Some places it actually says mesencephalic aqueduct. Does it say that here? No, it's just not labeled here. Okay, so the aqueduct is there. Got it? Okay, so the portion of your brain that is responsible for visual and auditory reflexes has projection tracts to and from the brain and the spinal cord is called what? The mesencephalon. Got it? Okay. And then you'd have to be able to find the mesencephalon on an image, right? Okay. So somebody describe to me, I know I've done it for you before, but I know this crap is hard and people have a hard time with it, so you guys do it for me. Describe the location of the mesencephalon. Play Magic School Bus with me and pretend that I can't. You're not with me, and I've got a picture in front of me, and you're trying to tell me where to find the mesencephalon. You can't point to it. You just have to tell me where to find it. Somebody raise their hand. Go ahead.
It's on top of the pons.
On top of the pons, good.
Superior to the brainstem.
And superior to the brainstem. Okay. Tell me when to stop, because is it all of this up here? Go ahead.
So the draw a line from the pituitary gland all the way to the pineal gland
Below that, right. So you guys got it together. Does that make sense? Okay. So you need to be confident about finding things on pictures like I've shown you. I'm not going to ask you to find it on this picture because you're like, what the hell am I even looking at? I don't even know, right? But on pictures that we've been reinforcing, you should be able to find it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So now we are going to obviously move down to the pons. You ready? But the pons is really easy to find, guys. If you can't find it, you are not paying attention. It's this big chunk that you can see on almost any picture. Is that chunk right there? Right before the brainstem starts getting skinnier and skinnier and skinnier. That's the pons. It's also the easiest thing to spell in the entire thing. So if I write a fill-in-the-blank question that's pons, spell it right, right? It's only got 4 letters. Do not put a D in it, okay? Because I could have asked you mesencephalic aqueduct. Right, but I asked you pons, so spell it right. Okay, so the pons, we are going to move down. It's the next portion of the brainstem. You can see it right here, right? Okay, look at it. Just look at it for a second and tell me. Well, I'll tell you, and then you tell me. First, I'm going to tell you that the pons has both gray matter and white matter in it, okay? And you guys are going to look at the picture of the pons and tell me what kind of tracts you expect to find on the outside of the pons. Not projection. Those are commissural tracts. Do you see those? Because they're going left to right. Does that make sense? Okay, there are projection tracts in there, by the way. I'll show you the projection tracts in just a second. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so let's look at the pons in a little bit more detail. You ready? Okay, so if you look at the pons in a little bit more detail, that's pons. Okay, so the pons in a little bit more detail, you can actually see that there's both kind of tracts. Wrapped around the outside and giving it that striping are the commissural tracts. But do you see these and those? Those are projection tracts. So it has white matter, and the white matter does kind of what you would expect it to do. The projection tracts are just going lower structures to higher structures, right? Brain, spinal cord, whatever. But these are actually doing something funny, believe it or not. These commissural tracts actually go through the pons to connect the left and the right halves of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum talks to the other side of the cerebellum through the pons. Okay? So, now, as far as the gray matter in the pons, there are several different nuclei. You don't have to know them by name, but the big picture of what the pons does is it is partially in control of your respiration. So now we are, remember, moving toward old functionalities. We've got reflexes that keep us alive. We've got control of respiration in the pons. It also controls urination, but that's not necessarily life-sustaining, right? Okay, so respiration. Everybody okay? Okay, so the pons in this picture would look like that, or like this, okay? So now I would never ask you this picture, FYI. because that's like impossible. But the only thing it's really showing you is that if you did a cross-section of the pons, you'd see gray matter and white matter. But, and really, all I'd ask you is like point to an obvious picture of the pons, maybe better picture than this, and ask you something about functionality or something about where gray matter and white matter in the pons. That's it, right? Okay, so so white matter commissural tracts that allow communication between the cerebellar hemispheres, and projection tracts that go cerebrum, cerebellum, up and down. Okay, there are cranial nerves there, but I'm not asking you cranial nerves on this test. So you can go back and pick up the cranial nerves later. They take a little while to understand. Okay, now we are ready for the lowest portion of the brainstem. You ready? We're moving down one more. So moving down one more, two. So brainstem again, let's do it one more time. Top portion of the brainstem is called? Mesencephalon. Then you move down to the pons, and then you move down to the medulla oblongata. What's the relationship of the pons to the fourth ventricle? Pons is anterior to the fourth ventricle. The cerebellum is posterior to the fourth ventricle. Got it? Okay. And now we are moving down to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, you can look at it and tell that it's got gray matter and white matter, right? Just in that picture. Okay. Now, without me even telling you, what do you think most of the white matter is in the medulla oblongata? What kind of tracts? Projection tracts, right? Because it's primarily connecting your spinal cord to your brain. Spinal cord to brain, spinal cord to brain. Does that make sense? Okay. So the medulla oblongata, FYI, it's called medulla oblongata from below the pons until you hit the foramen magnum. But when you hit the foramen magnum, that's the top of the spinal cord. It's kind of an arbitrary designation. FYI, the bottom of the medulla oblongata looks exactly like the top of the spinal cord because they're really just continuous with one another, okay? The top of the medulla oblongata has some special functions. Okay, so again, the medulla oblongata, you will not have to know these nuclei at all. But look at, there's a cardiac and vasomotor center in there. There's also some respiratory centers in there. So what is the medulla oblongata going to do? It's going to help the pons with controlling respiration, and it's going to control almost all of your cardiovascular function. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so now we have gotten to life-sustaining functions. So could you, if somebody fed you, live without your cerebral cortex? Yes. Could you, even if somebody fed you, live without your brainstem? No, you ain't living without your brainstem. Does that make sense to you? So these are immediately life-sustaining functions, and if you damage your brainstem, you're going to die. Is that okay? Okay, so these are really, really old functionality. So let's look at what it does. So the medulla oblongata is composed of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter control breathing, heart rate, and respiration. They also control vasoconstriction and vasodilation of your blood vessels. So like all of blood pressure is controlled there. And we'll keep that in mind for just a second. So, and then white matter projection tracts. And then remember the other important thing about the medulla oblongata is this is where the decussation of pyramids occurs, right? It's where your projection tracts cross, right? That's what the white matter. You would never have to label this on this image because it's confusing as hell. But you should know that the white matter tracts, the projection tracts actually cross in the medulla oblongata. That's where they cross. Good? Okay. All right, so the fourth ventricle is way down here in the brainstem, and you guys know that. Mostly it's over by the time you get to the medulla oblongata. Some people still consider a little bit of that the fourth ventricle. Okay, so let us look at this real quick to make sure that we can understand. Let's see. Broca's area, cingulate gyrus, hippocampus, thalamus, Wernicke's area, temporal, somatosensory cortex. Okay, let's just find it with reference to this one. Okay. We'll do, brainstem. Okay, so let's look at the brainstem. Okay, ready guys? The part in blue is what? Mesencephalon. The part in purple is what? Pons. The first purple. The part in pinky purple is medulla oblongata. Got it? Okay. All right. Do you guys think you can do that? Okay. All right. Last portion of the brain is actually pretty easy and kind of an interesting story, and that is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is right back here. It's right back here under your occipital bone, okay? And even though it's near the brainstem, it's actually not as old as the brainstem. It kind of develops. It's older than the newest portion of the cerebrum, but it's not as old as the brainstem. So it has a really characteristic structure and texture. It kind of looks like hamburger to me, honestly. It has folding on the cortex, and they actually call it the cerebellar cortex. But the folding is different than the gyri and sulci that you have on the cerebral cortex. The folding, somebody thought it looked like an evergreen tree, and it kind of does if you look at this picture, right? So this folding is called folia, which means leaves, okay? So it's called the folia, and it's gray matter on the outside, it's white matter on the inside. Everybody good? Okay. Gray matter is called the folia. White matter, do you see that it forms this tree branch looking structure? That's called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life, because they used to think that it was, because it was down there by the brainstem, that it was responsible for life-sustaining functionality. And now we know that it's not, but they didn't change the name. So the arbor vitae of the cerebellum is there, okay? And basically, do you see that it would be getting watered by the cerebral spinal fluid in the fourth ventricle? Yeah? You'd be watering the tree down there? Okay, so now let's put together with some things that we learned before. Remember our fissures. I don't know if I taught you this one. So this is the longitudinal fissure, yeah? Okay, this one right here is called the transverse fissure, and it would separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and it has a chunk of dura mater in it. Do you remember what that chunk of dura mater is that goes this way? Falx goes that way. This one? This is the tentorium, right? Okay, but what is the chunk that goes right in there? No, the chunk of dura mater. That's the falx cerebelli. Okay, and it goes on top of the vermis. Remember that you had a chunk that separated the two halves of the cerebellum, right? A chunk that separated the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and a chunk that separated the two halves of the cerebrum. So let's name them again, because they're related to the story, and they're on your test too. Ready? What's this one called? The chunk of dura mater right here. Falx cerebri. Okay, what's this one called? Tentorium, what? Cerebelli. And this one? Falx cerebelli. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay, so just to put that together. Okay, the vermis is this wormy looking part, like vermin. So it looks kind of like an earthworm. It's that gray matter in the middle that is like between the two halves, the two cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, so let's talk about the function of cerebellum, which is actually really interesting. Okay, so the function of the cerebellum is to coordinate and smooth your body movements, and it is where what people call muscle memory actually exists. It does not exist in your muscles. So when you learn something physical and figure out how to do something physical, whether it's playing the piano or playing tennis or pitching a ball, right? What happens is when you first learn it, or if it's riding a bike, so everybody knows how to ride. Well, actually, a lot of people don't know how to ride a bike, but most everybody knows how to ride a bike. I'm amazed. Like, I think it's like, I know a lot of teenagers now who don't know how to ride a bike. Do you know any teenagers who don't know how to ride a bike? And I think it's because they spend all their time indoors. Isn't that amazing? Like, I had to ride my bike everywhere. Ain't nobody driving me anywhere. Like, get on your bike and go. So when you first learn how to ride a bike, here's what occurs. You have to use your cerebral cortex to figure out what's going on. So think about being 5 years old or whenever the hell you learn how to ride a bike. What has to happen is you have to use intellectual processing to figure out when to put your right foot forward, your left foot back, and how to balance yourself. And you see kids doing it, and it's hard. Like, you don't have these coordinated, smooth motor movements for quite a while. And so they fall over, and you are trying to describe it to them, and they can't quite do it yet. That's all cerebral cortex, right? But then once you actually learn it, right, and you've reinforced it, and you know the pattern, all you have to do is use your cerebral cortex to initiate it. And after you've learned a pattern of muscle activity, your cerebellum remembers the pattern, and it's faster and smoother at the pattern than your cerebral cortex is. So what you would do in that situation is you use your cerebral cortex to decide, I'm going to ride a bike. And you get on the bike, right? And you push, and the first couple pushes are with your cerebral cortex. And then you pass it off to your cerebellum. Why? What is the advantage to passing it off to your cerebellum? It frees up your cerebral cortex to do some math problems, figure out how the hell you're going to pay your bills, right? Whatever the hell you need to do, right? So it frees up your cerebral cortex. So what happens in that situation is your muscle memory is really in your cerebellum. But your cerebellum needs to be taught and patterned by your cerebral cortex, right? Your cerebral cortex. So you use this when you are doing, for instance, athletic activity. If you learn how to do something, how to play the piano, or how to do backhand in tennis, you learn it with your cerebral cortex, you pass it off to your cerebellum. And let's say you're a tennis player. What will happen is the practice part reinforces the pattern, and then the cerebellum gets really smooth at the pattern and really fast at the pattern. And then what happens is when you go play a game, should you think about what you're actually doing intellectually? Should you think about trying to make a backhand? No, you should make your cerebral cortex shut the hell up, because it's not very smooth and it's not very fast at doing the activities. Your cerebellum is really smooth and really fast at doing the activities. Does that make sense? So you know what happens when you get all in your head when you're trying to do something, motor activity? You suck at it, right? You just completely suck at it. So you also experience this in times in which if you have like a really regular route that you drive to and from work or to and from school, what happens is the pattern becomes so very familiar that you're actually not involving your cerebral cortex in the activity any more than necessary. So have you ever, I'm talking sober here, okay? Have you ever driven home and had no recollection of driving home whatsoever? That is because what you are doing is, that only happens with familiar patterns. It's not going to happen like if you go, to Panguitch and you've never been to Panguitch before, right? You'll be like, oh, cow, another cow, another cow. Okay, so you are going to initiate the activity with your cerebral cortex, and then it's pretty much going to be your cerebellum, only you don't turn your cerebral cortex off because your brain doesn't know when the red lights are going to occur, right? So when a red light occurs, what happens is your cerebral cortex clicks in for a second, because you've changed the pattern, right? And then as soon as it turns green, you actually initiate the pattern again. And then if somebody walks in front of your car, cerebral cortex clicks in. Somebody riding a bike and a cat goes in front of you, cerebral cortex clicks in, and then you pass it off to your cerebellum again. The interesting thing about using your cerebellum is that it's not actually the best way to do intellectual things like driving, because the click in from cerebellum to cerebrum is not as fast as if you had already had your cerebrum engaged. So we tend to get really complacent about the sensory input when we're doing things that we've done over and over again, right? And that may be great when you're playing tennis. It's not super great when you're driving, although we all do it, right? Everybody does it. You do not need to add to that using your phone, drinking some booze, or having not slept for 48 hours, right, into that equation. So that's the cerebellum. I'll tell you one little other tidbit about the cerebellum, and then we'll move on to cranial nerves. One of the first semesters I was teaching when I was in Texas, I had a student, and she was teeny tiny. She was like maybe 4'11", and I was teaching about the brain, and she happened to be in lab. I taught lecture and lab there. And she wanted to tell me her story, and I was in a hurry to go from one class to the other, and I was like, okay, walk with me, and you can tell me. She's like, I can't walk with you and tell you this story, so I'll just meet you at your office. And then she got to my office, and she's like, I can't actually walk and talk at the same time, because when I was in high school, I was a cheerleader, and I was the smallest one, so I was always on top of the pyramid. She fell off the pyramid one too many times, and the last time she fell off, she actually damaged her cerebellum. And so she lost all of her coordination and smoothing of motor activity, which of course ended her cheerleading days. But that was the least of her worries, because she literally could not walk and talk at the same time, because when she walked, she was thinking left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Like that's what she was actually doing. And she couldn't use her intellectual processing for other things. So she had to like wait and meet me in my office, which was kind of interesting. She said when it first happened, she couldn't walk. But later on, she retrained herself and she could walk. She couldn't dance anymore. She couldn't be a cheerleader anymore. But she actually could walk. Okay, so fourth ventricle is located anterior to the cerebellum. Okay, so now we are going to do cranial nerves. But, guys, I'm going to reinforce, cranial nerves are not going to be on your test. They're going to be on your third test, okay, not your second test. Because understanding these takes a little while, and finding them, you actually need to be able to find them on a brain. So I want you to have that physical experience before you do this. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit of overview of the cranial nerves, and then you're going to learn them in detail in lab. But the overview of the cranial nerves are, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. You with me? 12 pairs of cranial nerves, okay? And they are nerves, not tracts, which means that they are going to be myelinated differently, yes? Okay? Their primary function is to bring sensory information to and motor information from the brain to mostly the head. So mostly they are controlling sensory and motor head stuff, but not exclusively, okay? Does that make sense to you? Okay, so these are called the cranial nerves. Now, you will eventually, although not by Thursday, have to know them by their names and their numbers. They are either named for what they do, like the olfactory nerves, the optic nerve, or for what hole they go through. The hypoglossal nerve, right, goes through a hole, or sometimes for what they do. The glossopharyngeal nerve for where it goes. Unfortunately, there's no like consistent naming convention for how they were named. So you'll need to know them by location, by name, and by number. They are numbered Roman numerals 1 through 12, okay? And if you don't know Roman numerals, you have to learn at least 1 through 12, okay? You don't have to learn all the Roman numerals. I couldn't write 562 in Roman numerals to save my damn life, but I can write 1 through 12, okay? So you need to know them. And why do you have to do that? Because very, very frequently, they do not tell you the glossopharyngeal nerve. They say CNIX, which is cranial nerve number 9. If you didn't know what IX is, you got to figure it out. Okay? That makes sense to you? Okay, so as far as functionality, let's just talk about them over an overview, and then you're going to do them in lab. They are either sensory, motor, or both. Yes? So they could be exclusively sensory, like this one. This is the optic nerve. The optic nerve is pretty damn busy doing eye sensation. It's got no room and no time for doing motor activity. So that one's exclusively sensory. But that's okay, because we farmed out the motor activity to this one, which is the oculomotor nerve, which does motor control of the eye, right? And then some of them are both. As a matter of fact, most of them are both, meaning that they have some sensory function and some motor function. Does that make sense? Got it? Okay, so you will learn sensory, motor, or both, and then there's one other thing that you will do about each one. The ones with motor function, if it's somatic motor, like controls mastication, you would have to know that. But if it's autonomic motor, like controls salivary gland secretion, you would have to know the autonomic, right? Does that make sense? So you'd have to know whether it's somatic or autonomic. And why the hell is that important? This little booger right here, see this vagus nerve? See if I can put something together for you to make anatomy make a little bit more sense. The vagus nerve's autonomic function is it controls the heart, yes? And it controls the heart. So it's one of the exceptions to the rule of controlling head stuff. It actually wanders like a vagrant down to control the heart. But that's probably okay, because which part of the brain do you think is actually going to give its signal to control the heart rate? The medulla oblongata. Have you ever heard that the medulla oblongata controls heart rates? You literally just did. How does it control heart rates? By sending out a nerve, the vagus nerve, down to the heart. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So you will not memorize these quickly. We'll give you some time to do that, but I have a silly little video that makes me very happy to show you guys. This was put together by some med students in Texas, and it is them with a song. He doesn't even sing very well, but he's braver than all of us, so we ain't going to diss him, right? Okay. A song that tells you names, numbers, and function, sensory, motor, or both for all of the cranial nerves, and it just makes me really happy. So, ready? I'm trying to memorize, especially the part where he starts using his hands to signal it. Cranial nerve 1 is olfactory. 2, optic. Oculomotor. What? I know, he's not bad. He's better than me. I can't memorize this. I asked you guys to memorize it last semester. You didn't do it. Okay. 11. You'll never forget that one, will you? This is the names. There are dirtier mnemonics. This. Okay. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. I mean, you can say boobs, but brains makes more sense here. That one's sensory motor or both. That's what that one is. This is the part I want to learn, but I can't remember it. Some say marry money, but my brother says it brings back more. I sing that damn song in my head when I'm trying to remember sensory motor or both every single time. Okay, so